I'm Tisha Bader, and in the news, the recommendation published just days ago by Israel police to indict Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel police said on Tuesday that there is sufficient evidence to indict the prime minister for fraud, breach of trust, and bribery. Their recommendation will now be considered by Israel's Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit, who will ultimately decide whether, in fact, to indict Netanyahu. Here to help us understand the two cases against the prime minister and what the Israeli public is thinking about this is journalist Raoul Wootliff. Raoul is political correspondent for the Times of Israel, and he has been closely following this story and has written about it extensively for the Times of Israel. Raoul, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on JBS today.
My pleasure.
So firstly, what are these two cases about? What do they allege the prime minister did?
Well, these two cases, which have been the subject of 2-year-long investigations by the Israel police, deal both with examples or allegations that the Prime Minister took gifts or certain favors from businessmen in return for other favors that he gave using his position as Prime Minister. In the first case, which has been named by police Case 1000, he's accused of receiving gifts worth up to 1 million shekels, around $280,000, from two billionaires in particular, Arnon Milchan, an Israeli Hollywood producer, and James Packer, a Australian investor. And in return for those gifts, he's accused of setting up a number of schemes and pushing a number of measures that would have benefited those billionaire benefactors financially. So some of the examples that police gave, and these could potentially be separate indictments when presented by the Attorney General, are a tax law that the Prime Minister pushed that would have given certain tax exemptions to some of these billionaires, a project on the Israel-Jordanian border, which one of the billionaires was involved in and could have benefited financially, helping organize a visa to the United States, in which he personally called Secretary of State John Kerry a number of times to help push through. According to police, these deals prove that the gifts that Netanyahu got were not just normal gifts that you would have got from a friend, but were in fact bribes, and therefore caused him to take certain actions in his role as Prime Minister. In the second case, which has been named Case 2000, the Prime Minister is accused of making a deal with a prominent newspaper publisher from Yediot Ahronot to receive better coverage in return for helping limit the circulation of a rival newspaper, the Yisrael Hayom paper, which traditionally has been very favorable to Netanyahu, and many have claimed has very close links to him through its owner, Shelton Edelson.
Now, what is your take, Raoul? Netanyahu continues to deny any wrongdoing. Of course, he says these cases and prior attempts to bring similar charges against him are politically motivated. They are personally motivated. People trying to get him out of the government. What do you make of that? What is your sense?
Well, we've seen throughout the past year during these investigations the line from Netanyahu, which is that there will be nothing because there is nothing. He said these cases will come to nothing. The truth will come out that there was nothing involved. And in recent months, he has increased that defense and turned it, as it were, on certain law authorities in Israel, particularly the police and potentially also the prosecutor's office, accusing them of running a witch hunt against him, guided by the left-wing Israeli media, as he puts it. It's clear from the police recommendations that the allegations are much more serious than many had expected throughout the year-long investigations. Up until now, it'd been assumed that the main benefit that he'd given in return for these gifts was a visa, helping organize a visa, and he said, This is not bribery, getting gifts from friends and then helping one out to get a visa. It's what I would have done for anyone. But the allegations that police are putting forward seem to be much more serious. And the question is whether the police have the evidence. They say that the evidence they've collected is enough to bring the Prime Minister to trial. It's hard to believe that in such a high-profile case that's taken so long and had so many twists and turns from the beginning that the police would say that without having collected sufficient evidence. But we'll have to see whether the Attorney General agrees with them. At this stage, based on what the police have said, it seems hard to imagine that there'll be no recommendation for indictment. Whether that indictment will be for bribery or for something else will be yet to be seen.
Interesting. How does the average Israeli view this? I mean, is there real concern, do you think, in the Israeli public that Netanyahu will be indicted and perhaps will step down? He doesn't have to step down necessarily. What is the feeling? What are you hearing on the streets, so to speak?
Well, up until now, there's been a sense of agreement with Netanyahu that in many places, in many sides of the Israeli political spectrum, both on the left and the right, that are questioning whether this really is bribery. In the case of former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who went to prison for corruption, there was money given in brown envelopes under the table. It's a very clear sense of what corruption and bribery means. Here, it's much more abstract. We're talking about gifts of cigars and champagnes that were given over many years and collectively made up a very high figure of 1 million shekels. But it's much harder to pinpoint where the exact corruption is. And even as I say that the police recommendations seem to be much more serious than we previously believed, it's possible, and the Prime Minister is trying to do so, to spin it, to say that actually these are things that I would have done for anyone. I wasn't especially making an effort and using my position in a way that was inappropriate. There's no bribery here. On the initial reaction from the Israeli public in a number of polls that were published yesterday is that more people than not think that the Prime Minister should step down. But at the same time, those polls showed that if elections were held today, the Likud, under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, would probably still win. Now, we can be very skeptical about those polls. They were based on a small group of people and taken just after the investigations. It does seem that at the moment the public discourse is very much questioning whether a Prime Minister can continue in his role while under such heavy legal pressure. But it seems that certainly Netanyahu's coalition is strong at the moment, and it seems unlikely that he would be forced out of office before any sort of decision by the Attorney General.
And do you think that is because of what Netanyahu himself said a number of times, that he's basically said, I'm the one you want in this seat. I'm the one you want when it comes to protecting the state of Israel and dealing with Iran and Syria and all these other, major challenges and threats that Israel faces. And you just mentioned that poll saying that people would still want him in the position of being prime minister. So is that where it's coming from? Do you think that, okay, all these allegations and indictments aside, at the end of the day, we need somebody who can protect us?
I mean, that's certainly an argument that's been made both by him and others. And at the moment, it seems unlikely it seems that the Israeli public does not trust anyone else yet to be the replacement for Benjamin Netanyahu. He has, after all, been prime minister for 9 years, and having held many different ministerial positions, he has an experience and gravitas above anyone else in the political theatre at the moment in Israel. But his claim where he says I still have the public support. He said that if there were to be elections today, he would still win. To me, it feels a little bit like, I don't know if you're familiar with the program Game of Thrones,
Sure.
In which sometimes they suggest a trial by combat as opposed to a formal trial in which two people making one claim will fight each other, and the winner will be ruled as the person who is most just. an election at this point wouldn't prove that he's not corrupt. It would prove that he still has support from the public, but it would not do anything to quell the allegations the police have said. So even though he suggested it, and it could happen that we'll have elections before this case is over, the result of those elections wouldn't prove that he's innocent. It would prove that he has the support of the public, and at the end of the day, even though at the moment he wouldn't be forced to resign, there is a legal process in place where the Prime Minister cannot continue to serve after convicted, and that conviction is upheld by an appeals court.
Now, how long do you think it will take for the Attorney General to make his decision? He has these recommendations from the police. Is there any sort of time limit as far as when Mandelblit has to decide, or what does that process look like?
There's not a time limit. Now that the police have made their recommendations, the entire material of the year-long investigations have been passed to the State Prosecution's Office, and they will first and foremost be reviewed by the Tel Aviv state prosecutor, who has been appointed to overlook these recommendations. It's likely that her work will take 2 or 3 months. Then the case will be referred to the state prosecutor, Shai Nitzan, and again, I'm just estimating here that process is also likely to take another 2 or 3 months, and only then will it go to the Attorney General, who will review all of the work that's been done up until then, and that could take another few months again, and he'll then invite, if he decides to go ahead with an indictment, he would invite the Prime Minister and his lawyers for a hearing, and to do so, he would have to then turn over the entire case, all of the material collected by the police, to Netanyahu's lawyers, who would have 3 months to review it and come forward to present their side before a final decision of the indictment is made. At this stage, I would estimate that the minimum period of time that would take would be 6 months in total. Although in this case, as has been pointed out by some, the Attorney General has been much more involved in the investigations than other Attorney Generals have been in previous investigations of high-level public officials. So it's possible that due to the fact that he's already familiar with the material, the process could be much less. Saying that, though, I think with the consequences of what an indictment would mean, I think it's unlikely that we're going to have a rush decision here. It will probably be at least half a year.
Wow, so that's quite a long time. In the meantime, you're saying that the trust in Netanyahu seems to be fairly there as far as the Israeli public. What happens, though, if he is in fact indicted? Are there a couple of different scenarios that could be? He could remain in office. He could be pressured to step down, as you mentioned in the case with Ehud Olmert. It was different, and that he was ultimately sent to jail. Is the difference in the complexity of this case and it being perhaps harder to prove?
Well, let me say firstly, according to the law, a minister or prime minister doesn't have to step down when indicted. They only have to step down in the case of a prime minister when convicted and that conviction is upheld in an appeals court. Now, that could take many, many years. However, and without getting too technical, in the case of Aryeh Deri, the Interior Minister, in 1993, he was indicted for corruption, and the Supreme Court ruled that when a minister is indicted, even though it's not written in the law, he can no longer continue in his position as a minister. And therefore, the Supreme Court ruled that the Prime Minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, must fire Aryeh Deri from the cabinet, and so that he can no longer continue to be a minister. Now, that legal precedent could, in this case, force the Prime Minister to resign, although it's slightly different because we've never had it with a Prime Minister. And in that case, as I said, the Supreme Court ruled that the Prime Minister had to fire the minister. Here, there can't be a situation where the Prime Minister would have to fire himself, so there would have to be a slightly different process in place. What will most likely happen if there is an indictment made by the Attorney General and Netanyahu does not resign, then we'll have appeals to the Supreme Court asking them to intervene and make a similar ruling than they did with Aryeh Deri. It's unclear what that would mean, but in my estimation, an indictment against the Prime Minister, even if he's not forced legally to step down, would be the end of his political career, at least for this stage.
Really?
The other parties in his coalition have said that they're standing by him for the moment. But one of the key arguments that they've made is that these police recommendations have no legal status, and the only thing that has a legal status is the recommendation by the Attorney General. Now, what we can decipher or even hear very clearly from those statements is that if a recommendation is made by the Attorney General, then we're in a very different situation. Those parties would certainly face a lot of pressure from the public to change their allegiance from to Netanyahu, and we may also see some opposition from within the Likud party. At the moment, the Likud party is united behind the Prime Minister, but we've started to see maybe two camps within the Likud. One who is vehemently attacking the police and attacking people who have been involved in these investigations and saying that the Prime Minister is absolutely innocent. And the other, perhaps the more moderate Likud MKs who have said similar things to some of the other coalition partners, i.e., we have to wait to see what the Attorney General is going to say. And as I said, if the Attorney General decides to indict, I find it hard to see how the Prime Minister would be able to hold on.
Interesting. And Raoul, just throwing it out there, is there anyone who you see on the Israeli political scene today that could perhaps become the next Prime Minister if that in fact happens? Is there somebody who stands out that you think would be vying for that?
Well, there are plenty of candidates that want to. In the polls, the person who seems most close to support from the public and most close to potentially gaining that support in an election would be Yesh Atid, the Yesh Atid leader Yair Lapid. There's an interesting twist in these elections, which complicates the situation with Yair Lapid, which is that in the recommendations we've understood that one of the witnesses, some who's described as a key witness, was Yair Lapid himself, who at the time when one of these cases was playing out was finance minister and was approached by the Prime Minister to help change this tax evasion law or this tax exemption law, and he refused. He's now given testimony, and many of the Likud MKs have come out and said this is clearly an attempt by Lapid to subvert the justice system just to replace Netanyahu. There's no doubt that it's a tricky situation when you have the key rival to the Prime Minister as a witness in a corruption case against him. It raises questions about how power changes hands in any democratic country. Nonetheless, at the moment, it still seems like Yair Lapid is the person with the most clout to challenge Netanyahu. But as we know in Israeli politics, anything can happen, and there are other contenders that could potentially rise from the tricky few months that we have ahead.
Now, Netanyahu also has suggested some, let's say, mistrust in the police. There were stories, and I don't know if there is any validity to this, and you can help me out here, that there were people following these police investigators. I don't know if that turned out to actually be something that was proven.
Well, in an interview that the police chief, Ronnie Alshich, gave last week, largely defending the actions of the police before the recommendations were made, he confirmed rumors that had been already put out by certain police sources that he said that during the investigations, high level there had been people at the highest level had set investigators on police in order to find dirt on them to to potentially damage the investigations. That's a very serious allegation. He's potentially alleging that the Prime Minister himself has sent people to find information about police investigators investigating him. His comments set off a number of different reactions in the Israeli political arena, both from Netanyahu's supporters, who said these are clearly untrue. There needs to be an investigation into the police chief, into why he's lying, and also from the opposition to Netanyahu, who said, if these are true, then this is incredibly serious, maybe even more serious than the corruption allegations that police have put out this week, and likewise have called for an investigation. On Sunday, the police commissioner will face Knesset members at a hearing initiated by Likud MKs to specifically ask about those allegations and those questions, and we'll have to see whether those allegations are proven, and if they could somehow play into these specific cases of corruption that the Prime Minister is being accused of.
An investigation into the investigation. There are so many levels to this. It seems a bit overwhelming at times. And I'll ask you just one more time, as far as the Israeli public, do you think this is something that's really weighing on their minds, that they're talking about, that they're having debates or discussions about? Or is it sort of like, oh, well, this is, we'll see what happens one way or the other. There's nothing we can do about it, and let's go about our day?
At this stage, it's still something that's certainly being discussed and debated across the country. But we're only 2 days after those police recommendations, and the longer this drags out, the less interest there will be. It's similar to how the investigations have played out. A year ago, when they started, there was huge public interest and huge public discourse and debates. But as the investigations dragged on, the public became less interested in the issue and in the investigations. Likewise, if the Attorney General takes his time, it seems that the public interest will wane. But as I said, the public interest is only one side to this. There's also how the Likud MKs and the coalition respond, and ultimately the legal decision of the Attorney General and the courts.
Well, it remains to be seen, Raul, what comes of this. I hope we'll be able to speak with you again as you continue to follow the story. You've done an incredible job trying to explain to the public what exactly these cases are about and what could possibly happen if, in fact, the indictment happens, how it will affect Prime Minister Netanyahu's position and Israel's political future. So we will look forward to speaking with you again, I hope.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raul, for sharing your time and your perspective with us today on JBS in this complex case and its possible repercussions in Israeli society and the political future. Raul Wittliff is political correspondent for the Times of Israel. We thank him very much. And as always, thank you to our director and production coordinator, Sloan Copeland, JBS Associate Director, Dara Golub, and to our editors, John McDevitt and Cordelia Siporin, and producer, Carol Lilienthal. I'm Tisha Bader for this edition of In the News.